The radar screen went dark at 8:47 hours, and in that moment, General Marcus Haverton made a decision that would haunt him for the rest of his career. He declared Captain Nyla Cowery dead. The A-10 Thunderbolt II, call sign Reaper 7, had vanished over the Helmand Valley during what should have been a routine close air support mission. No ejection beacon, no distress call, just silence where there had been the steady pulse of a transponder. Haverton stood in the operations center at Bagram Airfield, surrounded by screens that showed nothing but empty sky, and he made the call. She was gone. The paperwork would be processed. The family would be notified. Another name for the memorial wall. But something felt wrong to Lieutenant Ames Volkov, the air traffic controller who'd been tracking Reaper 7 since Wheels Up. He'd heard something in that last transmission, something beneath the static that didn't sound like death. It sounded like determination. Volkov had been in the tower for 6 years, long enough to know the difference between a pilot accepting fate and a pilot refusing it. He'd heard both. Cowery's voice had been the latter, but generals don't listen to lieutenants, especially not when the evidence is so clear. The A-10 had been flying low, providing gun runs for a Marine unit pinned down by Taliban fighters in a dried riverbed. The mission had gone sideways when shoulder-fired missiles started tracking up from the ridgeline. Reaper 7 had taken a hit. Everyone in the operations center had heard the explosion over the radio, followed by Cowery's clipped report of hydraulic failure. Then nothing. Haverton had given her 10 minutes. 10 minutes of silence before he made the call. It was protocol, it was necessary. It was also premature. Because 90 miles away, beneath a sky the color of old brass, Nyla Cowery was still flying. The A-10 around her was dying, but she wasn't. The right engine was gone, torn apart by the missile's proximity fuse. The left engine was running on borrowed time, temperature gauges pushing into the red. Hydraulic fluid painted the inside of the cockpit in dark streaks. The stick felt like moving concrete. Every control input required both hands and all her strength. The aircraft shuddered and groaned, metal screaming against physics. But it was still airborne. Barely. Cowery's hands were steady on the controls, even as blood ran down from a gash above her left eyebrow, courtesy of shrapnel that had punched through the canopy. She could taste copper and jet fuel. Her vision swam, then cleared, then swam again. She keyed the radio with fingers that felt like they belonged to someone else. Nothing. The communication suite was dead, circuits fried by electrical fire that had filled the cockpit with acrid smoke before she'd managed to kill the power to that section. She was flying on backup instruments, some of them analog gauges that belonged in a museum. The A-10 had been built to take punishment, designed by people who understood that war was messy, and pilots needed machines that could absorb hell and keep moving. Cowery was testing those limits now. The aircraft had over 100 holes in it, maybe more. She'd stopped counting after 50. Some were small, the size of fists. Others were large enough to see through, jagged tears in the fuselage that showed daylight in the landscape below. The tail section looked like Swiss cheese. One of the vertical stabilizers was partially gone, sheared off by something that had come too close. The aircraft shouldn't have been flying. Every aerodynamic principle said it should be tumbling from the sky in a death spiral. But Cowery had other ideas. She'd nursed wounded birds home before, back in her days flying crop dusters in the Central Valley before the military. That felt like another life now, another person entirely. But the skills were the same. Feel the aircraft. Listen to what it's telling you. Don't fight it, work with it. The A-10 wanted to roll left. She gave it a little left, then coaxed it back with gentle pressure. The stick vibrated in her hands, a grinding sensation that meant the control surfaces were barely responding. She was flying a 40,000-pound glider with a bad attitude and one engine. The mountains of Afghanistan spread out below her, all brown and gray and unforgiving. She needed to gain altitude, needed to clear the ridgelines between her and Bagram. But the A-10 was losing height, sinking slowly despite her best efforts. The working engine couldn't produce enough thrust to maintain level flight, not with this much damage, not with the drag from all those holes. She did the math in her head. Distance to base, 87 miles. Current altitude, 8,000 feet. Rate of descent, roughly 200 feet per minute. She'd be on the ground in 40 minutes, one way or another. The question was whether she'd be on a runway or scattered across a mountainside. Cowrie adjusted her grip on the stick, feeling the aircraft shudder beneath her. Her call sign had been given to her as a joke, back in flight school: Reaper. The instructors thought it was funny because she was small, barely 5'4", with a quiet voice and a tendency to apologize when she spoke. She didn't look like death. She looked like someone who should be teaching kindergarten or working in a library. But she'd kept the call sign because she understood something the jokers didn't. Reapers don't announce themselves. They just show up and do the work. And the work right now was staying alive. She checked her remaining fuel. The gauge showed less than 1,000 pounds, most of it in the left tank. The right tank had been punctured, bleeding JP-8 into the slipstream for the past 20 minutes. She'd been lucky it hadn't ignited, lucky the tracer rounds that had stitched across the wing hadn't found the fuel. But luck ran out. It always did. The landscape below changed from mountains to foothills, the terrain gradually flattening. She was making progress, though the altimeter continued its steady unwind. 7,000 feet now. The engine temperature was climbing, the gauge needle pushing past the red line into territory marked only by blank dial. She could smell it, even through her oxygen mask, a hot metal scent that meant bearings were failing and turbine blades were eating themselves. If the engine seized or caught fire, she'd have seconds to eject. But ejection over this terrain meant landing in hostile territory with injuries, and she'd seen enough intelligence reports to know what happened to downed pilots. She'd take her chances with the dying aircraft. Her left hand moved to the auxiliary power switch, tried it again even though she knew it wouldn't work. Dead. No electrical power meant no radio, meant no one knew she was coming, or that she was alive. They'd already written her off. She could picture the scene in the operations center. Haverton at the head of the table making the call. Voices agreeing, nodding. Process and protocol. Check the box, move on to the next crisis. It made her angry, which was good. Anger was fuel. She'd been underestimated her whole career. Too small, too quiet, too female. The old guard never said it directly, but she could see it in their eyes, hear it in their voices when they questioned her decisions. She'd proven herself 100 times, flown missions that made grown men nervous, put ordnance on target in conditions that grounded half the squadron. And still, they looked at her and saw someone who didn't belong. Haverton was the worst. He'd opposed her assignment to the squadron from the start, made his objections known through official channels and unofficial whispers. He didn't think women belonged in attack aircraft, and he especially didn't think they belonged in the A-10, the Warthog, the ugly beast built around a 7-barrel rotary cannon that could shred tanks. That was man's work in his estimation. Cowrie had stayed quiet, kept her head down, flown her missions. She'd learned that lesson early. Don't argue, just perform. Let the record speak. But the record didn't matter when you disappeared off radar. Then you were just another statistic, another name, another decision made by men in climate-controlled rooms who'd never felt an aircraft come apart around them. The altimeter read 6,000 feet. She was 20 miles from Bagram now, close enough that she should be able to see the air base if the visibility was good. But the canopy was cracked and coated with hydraulic fluid, turning the world into a distorted blur. She wiped at it with her gloved hand, succeeding only in spreading the fluid around. Didn't matter. She wasn't landing by sight anyway. She was landing by feel, by instinct, by sheer bloody-mindedness. The A-10 dropped through 5,000 feet. 4,000. The engine was making sounds that no engine should make, a grinding shriek that cut through even the wind noise. The temperature gauge had pegged at maximum. She could see smoke now, dark and oily, streaming from the cowling. Time was running out. Bagram Tower was quiet when Reaper 7 appeared on the radar screen. Volkov saw it first, a faint contact at the edge of the display, moving slowly, too slowly. He leaned forward, adjusted the gain, watched as the return solidified. The transponder code was wrong, corrupted, or damaged, but the trajectory was right. Something was coming home. He keyed the intercom to the operations center. His voice was steady, professional, but his hands were shaking. "Sir, I have an unidentified aircraft inbound from the northwest, bearing 285, range 15 miles. Speed is approximately 120 knots, altitude 3,000 feet and descending." Haverton's voice came back immediately, sharp and irritated. "Identify it." "Sir, the transponder code is corrupted, but the track matches Reaper 7's last known position and heading." Silence. Then, "That's impossible. Reaper 7 is down." "Sir, something is coming home." Volkov could hear the commotion in the background, voices rising, chairs scraping. He kept his eyes on the screen, watching the contact inch closer. 12 miles now, 2,500 feet. Whatever it was barely staying airborne. Haverton's voice came back, harder now. "All aircraft, this is Bagram Actual. We have an unidentified contact inbound. Alert the ready fighters. Get me visual confirmation immediately." Within seconds, two F-16s that had been on alert scrambled, afterburners lighting as they clawed for altitude. Their call signs were Viper 1 and Viper 2, and they reached intercept position in less than 3 minutes, pulling alongside the unknown aircraft. Viper 1's voice came over the radio, and there was something in his tone that Volkov had never heard before from the cocky fighter pilot. Disbelief. "Bagram, Viper 1 has visual. You're not going to believe this." "Report." "It's an A-10. Looks like it's been through a shredder. I count. Jesus, I can't even count the number of holes. The right engine is gone, smoke trailing from the left. Tail is shot to hell." "Can you identify the pilot?" There was a pause. Viper 1 maneuvered closer, close enough to see through the damaged canopy. "Bagram, the pilot is conscious and at the controls. It's Reaper 7, it's Captain Cowery. She's alive." The operations center erupted. Haverton stood frozen, staring at the speaker as if it had personally betrayed him. Around him, officers and technicians were scrambling, pulling up emergency protocols, clearing runways, alerting medical teams. But for a moment the general just stood there, his face unreadable. Volkov was already moving, coordinating with emergency services, vectoring the crashed trucks and ambulances to the runway. His hands flew across the controls, professional training overriding the adrenaline. But in his head he was cheering. He'd known. Somehow he'd known. In the cockpit of Reaper 7, Cowery saw the F-16s pull alongside. She couldn't hear their radio calls, couldn't tell them she was okay, or as okay as someone could be flying a mortally wounded aircraft. But she saw them, saw the pilots looking at her through their canopies, and she gave them a thumbs up. Her hand was shaking. The F-16s backed off, giving her space. They knew better than to crowd a damaged aircraft. Cowery focused on the task ahead. Bagram was 10 miles away now, visible through the haze as a dark line on the horizon. The runway waited, a strip of concrete that represented salvation. But getting there meant threading a needle. She was too low for a normal approach, too damaged to execute standard landing procedures. The gear was the next problem. She reached for the emergency landing gear extension handle, a mechanical backup that should deploy the wheels through gravity and air pressure alone. Nothing was guaranteed with this much damage. She pulled the handle, felt it move. Heard the groan of hydraulic-less machinery trying to work. The nose gear thumped down, locked. The left main gear followed, but the right main gear hung up, partially extended, the indicator showing unsafe. Of course, because nothing could be easy, Cowery made a decision. She'd land on what she had. The A-10 was tough. It could take a gear-up landing. Hell, at this point, a gear-up landing was the least of her problems. She'd come this far. She'd get it on the ground. The runway was 5 miles away. The aircraft was at 1,500 feet, sinking fast. The engine was screaming, the smell of burning metal filling the cockpit even through the oxygen mask. She adjusted her approach angle, aiming for the numbers at the end of the runway. No flaps, no speed brakes, just raw flying, managing energy through stick and throttle. 4 miles, 1,000 feet. The stall warning horn began to blare, adding to the symphony of alarms and warnings. She ignored it. Speed was life, but altitude was life too, and she had precious little of either. 3 miles. The A-10 was vibrating so badly her vision blurred. She could see individual buildings now, vehicles moving on the base, people pointing up. 2 miles, 500 feet. The engine quit. No warning, no sputter, just sudden, complete silence broken only by the wind. The A-10 was a glider now, a very poor glider with the aerodynamics of a brick. Cowery pitched the nose down slightly, trading altitude for airspeed, keeping it controllable. 1 mile. The runway was right there, so close. 300 feet, 200. The ground rushed up, gray concrete filling her vision. She hauled back on the stick, flaring, trying to bleed off speed. The A-10 hung in the air for a moment, fighting physics. Then it dropped. The impact was tremendous. The left main gear hit first, absorbed the shock, held. The nose gear hit next, a jarring crunch. The right main gear, partially extended, dug into the runway and collapsed, sending the right wing scraping across concrete in a shower of sparks. Cowery held the stick, kept the wings level as the aircraft slewed sideways, metal shrieking against pavement. The A-10 skidded down the runway, trailing debris and smoke. 500 yards, 400, 300. It was slowing, momentum bleeding away through friction and destruction. 200 yards, 100. The aircraft finally came to rest just off the runway centerline, tilted at an angle, right wing crumpled, battle damage visible from every angle. Crashed trucks were already moving, foam spraying before they even reached the aircraft. Cowery's hands were still on the controls, muscle memory refusing to let go even though the aircraft was stopped. She took a breath. Another. Her hands started shaking, really shaking now, adrenaline crashing as the reality of the last 90 minutes caught up with her. She reached up, unlatched the canopy. It opened halfway, jammed. She squeezed through the gap, rejecting the ladder that ground crew were rushing to position, and climbed down herself. Her legs were unsteady, but she stayed upright. To stay upright, couldn't show weakness, not now. The ground crew surrounded her, voices urgent, hands reaching to help. She waved them off, walked around the aircraft, needing to see the damage with her own eyes. It was worse than she'd thought. The entire right side of the fuselage looked like it had been attacked by a giant can opener. Holes everywhere, edges peeled back. The right engine was a blackened wreck. The tail section was barely attached. The right wing was destroyed. The aircraft should not have been able to fly. But it had. A vehicle screeched to a stop nearby. General Haverton climbed out, followed by a cluster of officers. He approached Cowery, his face a complex mixture of emotions: relief, anger, embarrassment. She snapped to attention, or as close to attention as she could manage given that she was swaying slightly and bleeding from multiple lacerations. Her flight suit was torn and stained with blood and hydraulic fluid. "Captain Cowery," Haverton said, his voice tight. "Sir." They stared at each other. "I declared you KIA," he said. It wasn't an apology. It was an accusation, as if she'd inconvenienced him by surviving. "Yes, sir," Cowery replied. She didn't elaborate. What was there to say? Around them, ground crew were already taking photos of the aircraft, documenting the damage. Someone counted the holes. Later, the official report would list 137 separate impacts, ranging from small arms fire to shrapnel from the missile. A-10 had been held together by little more than willpower and the skill of its pilot. Haverton looked at the aircraft, then back at Cowery. Something shifted in his expression. "How?" he asked, just that one word. Cowery considered her answer. She could give him the technical details, walk him through every decision and adjustment, but that wasn't what he was really asking. "It's what I do, sir," she said quietly. "I bring them home." Haverton held her gaze for a long moment, then nodded once. He turned and walked away, shoulders stiff. The other officers followed, leaving Cowery standing alone beside her aircraft. Well, not quite alone. Volkov had arrived, breathless from running across the tarmac. He stopped a respectful distance away, then approached when Cowery nodded. "Lieutenant," she said. "Captain, I knew you were still out there. Thank you for not giving up on me." Volkov looked at the aircraft, then at her. "Permission to speak freely, ma'am." "Granted." "That's the most badass thing I've ever seen." Despite everything, Cowery smiled. It hurt her split lip, but she didn't care. "Let's get you to medical," Volkov said. This time, Cowery didn't argue. She let him guide her toward the waiting ambulance, but she looked back once at the A-10. It sat there on the runway, broken but triumphant, a testament to engineering and determination. They'd probably never fly it again. The damage was too extensive, but that was okay. The aircraft had done its job. It had brought her home, and she had brought it home. That was the contract between pilot and machine, the unspoken bond. You take care of me, I'll take care of you. They'd both kept their end of the bargain. The medical team descended on her as soon as she reached the ambulance. They tried to make her lie down on the stretcher, but she refused, sitting upright instead. Through the open door, she could see the operations center in the distance, could imagine the chaos inside as they processed what had happened. She'd been dead. Now she was alive. Paperwork would have to be revised, reports rewritten, decisions reevaluated. Good, let them scramble, let them be uncomfortable. Maybe next time they'd wait longer before writing someone off. Maybe next time they'd have a little more faith. The ambulance drove slowly across the base, sirens silent. They passed rows of parked aircraft, Apache helicopters and Chinooks and F-16s. Pilots and crew chiefs stopped what they were doing to watch the ambulance pass. Some saluted, others just stared. Word was already spreading. The impossible landing. The pilot who refused to die. Within hours, the story would be in every ready room, every mess hall, every corner of the base. Within days, it would spread beyond Bagram to other bases, other squadrons. Within weeks, it would reach the States, circulating through military channels and eventually civilian news. But Cowery didn't know any of that yet. She was focused on the present, on the medic examining the gash above her eye, on the IV needle sliding into her arm, on the peculiar sensation of adrenaline draining away and leaving exhaustion in its wake. "You need stitches," the medic said. "Probably a dozen. And we need to do a full trauma assessment. You might have internal injuries." "I'm fine," Cowery said automatically. The medic gave her a look. "Ma'am, with respect, you're not fine. You're running on fumes and stubbornness." "That's my baseline," Cowery replied, but she didn't resist as the medic began cleaning the wound. The hospital was small, a collection of prefab buildings and tents that served as the base's medical facility. They treated everything here from routine illness to catastrophic combat injuries. One more pilot would barely register. Except it did register because this pilot had just done something extraordinary. The medical staff had heard the radio chatter, seen the aircraft come in. They knew. When Cowery was finally settled in an examination room, a doctor appeared. Major Alina Reyes, according to her name tag. She was in her 40s with the calm demeanor of someone who'd seen too much to be easily rattled. "Captain Cowery," she said, "let's see what we're dealing with." The examination was thorough and uncomfortable. Cowery endured it with the same stoicism she'd brought to keeping the A-10 airborne. Cuts and contusions, bruised ribs, mild concussion. Strained muscles in her arms and back from fighting the controls. Dehydration, exhaustion, but nothing life-threatening, nothing that wouldn't heal. "You're lucky," Reyes said as she finished stitching the gash. "Lucky," Cowery repeated. The word felt wrong. Luck was winning the lottery. Luck was finding a $20 bill on the ground. What she'd done wasn't luck, it was skill, it was experience, it was refusing to quit. But she didn't correct the doctor. People needed to believe in luck. It was easier than acknowledging that sometimes survival was a choice, a decision made and remade every second when everything was falling apart. "I'm keeping you overnight for observation," Reyes said. "The concussion concerns me and you need rest. I need to debrief. You need to not die, the debrief can wait." Reyes's tone left no room for argument. Cowery nodded, suddenly aware of how tired she was. Bone-deep tired, the kind that came from pushing the body beyond its limits. They moved her to a private room, little more than a curtained space with a bed and basic monitoring equipment. She lay down, still in her flight suit, too exhausted to change. The room was quiet except for the soft beep of the heart rate monitor and distant sounds of the hospital. She closed her eyes, expecting sleep to come immediately. Instead, her mind replayed the flight, every moment from the missile hit to the landing. She could still feel the stick in her hand, still hear the dying engine, still see the runway approaching. Post-mission analysis, automatic and unavoidable. What had she done right? What could she have done better? Different decisions, different outcomes. If she'd climbed instead of staying low, would the missile have missed? If she'd headed for a closer base, would it have mattered? But those questions were pointless. She'd made the calls she'd made based on the information she'd had. Second-guessing was a luxury reserved for people who survived. She'd survived. The thought should have brought relief, maybe even joy. Instead, she felt hollow. That would come later, she knew. The emotional response was delayed, held at bay by adrenaline and training. In a day or two, when her body remembered it was allowed to feel things, the reaction would hit. Shaking hands, racing heart, maybe tears, maybe anger. It was different for everyone. She'd been through it before, though never quite like this. A nurse checked on her, recorded vitals, asked if she needed anything. Cowrie declined. What she needed couldn't be provided by the hospital. She needed time, she needed space, she needed to process, but mostly she needed to not be alone with her thoughts. The door opened again. She expected another medical staff member. Instead, it was Volkov. He carried a tablet and looked uncertain, as if he wasn't sure he should be there. "Captain, I'm sorry to disturb you, but there's something you should know." Cowrie sat up, instantly alert. "What is it?" "The Marines you were supporting, the ones pinned down, they made it out, all of them. Your gun runs broke the ambush, gave them time to extract." He paused. "They're asking about you. They heard what happened. They want to thank you." "That's not necessary." "They think it is. You saved their lives, then you saved your own. They're calling you a legend." Cowrie shook her head. "I was doing my job." "Maybe, but the way you did it." Volkov trailed off, searching for words. "There are already people saying this is going to be in the history books. The landing, I mean, one of the greats." "It's too early for that." "Is it?" Volkov pulled up something on his tablet, hesitated, then showed it to her. It was a photo of the A-10 taken from the side, showing the full extent of the damage. The image was striking, almost artistic in its devastation. The aircraft looked like it had been attacked by a swarm of angry metal-eating insects. And yet there it sat, intact enough to have landed. The caption was already circulating. "Reaper 7, she brought it home." Cowrie stared at the image. That was her aircraft, her responsibility, her burden for 90 impossible minutes. "How many holes?" she asked. "Final count is 137 impacts," Volkov said. "They're still finding more. The damage assessment team says it's one of the most severely damaged aircraft to ever successfully return to base. The A-10 is tough." "Sure, but it still needs a pilot." Volkov met her eyes. "They're going to want to interview you, public affairs, maybe even media. This is a big deal." "I don't want that." "I don't think you get a choice, ma'am." He wasn't wrong. Cowrie could already see how it would unfold. The story was too good, too dramatic. Female pilot, impossible odds, damaged aircraft, successful landing against all probability. It hit every note. They'd make her a symbol whether she wanted it or not. "Get some rest," Volkov said, backing toward the door. "I'll try to keep them away from you for as long as possible." "Thank you, Lieutenant." After he left, Cowrie lay back down, but sleep was even more elusive now. She thought about the Marines on the ground, about the gun runs she'd made before the missile hit. She'd been focused on the tactical situation, putting rounds on target, keeping the enemy suppressed. Standard close air support. She hadn't thought about it in terms of saving lives. That was too abstract, too emotional. But they were alive because of her. That meant something. It meant everything. Outside her room, Bagram Air Base continued its 24-hour rhythm. Aircraft took off and landed. Missions were flown. The war continued, indifferent to one pilot's unlikely survival. But in the operations center, the mood had shifted. Staff who'd been there for the crisis, who'd heard Haverton declare Cowrie KIA and then watched her land anyway, were processing their own reactions. Some felt vindicated, especially those like Volkov who'd believed she was still out there. Others felt guilty, complicit in giving up too soon. And Haverton sat in his office, door closed, staring at his computer screen. The formal KIA declaration document was still open, waiting to be filed. He'd have to write a completely different report now. One that explained his premature call, that justified the decision even though the outcome had proved him wrong. It was a humiliation, professionally and personally. But more than that, it was a revelation. He'd underestimated Cowrie from the beginning, questioned her assignment, doubted her capability, and she'd just proven him wrong in the most dramatic way possible. She'd survived something that should have killed her, brought home an aircraft that should have been unflyable. Done it without communications, without support, through sheer skill and determination. Everything he'd claimed she didn't have, she demonstrated in abundance. The general was not a man who admitted mistakes easily. His career had been built on certainty, on clear decisions and unwavering conviction. But sitting there with the evidence undeniable, he had to acknowledge the truth. He'd been wrong about her. The question was what he'd do with that knowledge. He could minimize it, bury the incident in paperwork and move on, or he could do something harder, something that required setting ego aside. His hand hovered over the keyboard, then he began typing. Not the KIA report, something else. A commendation, a formal recognition of exceptional airmanship and courage under fire. The words came slowly at first, then faster. He described the mission, the damage, the landing. He laid out the facts in clear, precise military language. And then, in the final paragraph, he wrote something that cost him more than he'd expected. Captain Cowery's actions reflect the highest standards of military aviation and serve as an example to all personnel. Her determination to complete the mission and bring her aircraft home, despite catastrophic damage and life-threatening injuries, demonstrates the warrior spirit that defines our Air Force. I recommend her for immediate consideration for the Distinguished Flying Cross. He read it over, made minor edits, then saved the document. It would go up the chain of command. It would become part of her permanent record, and it would, in a small way, begin to correct his mistake. Not the mistake of declaring her KIA, that had been reasonable given the circumstances, but the earlier mistake, the fundamental one, the mistake of not seeing her for what she was. She wasn't too small or too quiet or too female. She was a pilot, a damn good one, maybe one of the best he'd ever served with. That realization sat uncomfortably in his chest, like admitting defeat, but it was also liberating in a way. He'd spent so much energy maintaining his position, defending his views, that he'd stopped actually looking at the evidence. The evidence was clear now, time to adjust. He sent the commendation through, then leaned back in his chair. Tomorrow would bring more challenges, more decisions, but tonight he allowed himself a moment of respect for a pilot who'd earned it the hard way. In the hospital, Cowery finally slept. Her dreams were fragmented, filled with the sensation of flying, of struggling with controls that wouldn't respond, of ground approaching too fast. But they were just dreams. She was safe. The sun rose over Bagram Air Base, painting the mountains gold and orange. Another day in Afghanistan, another rotation of missions and personnel. But this day was different because word had spread. Breakfast conversations in the mess hall were dominated by one topic. Did you hear? Did you see? Reaper 7 made it back. Pilots who'd flown with Cowery weren't surprised. They'd known she was competent if underappreciated, but even they were impressed by the specifics. 137 holes. One engine, partial landing gear, and she'd greased the landing, relatively speaking. That took skill that couldn't be taught, only earned through hours and experience and raw talent. Pilots who'd never met her were impressed too, studying the photos that circulated on classified networks. They traced the damage patterns, tried to imagine the control inputs required to keep the aircraft stable. Most concluded they couldn't have done it. A few thought they might have tried differently. But all agreed, it was extraordinary. The story reached other bases, transmitted through official channels and unofficial gossip. At Kandahar, pilots gathered around computer screens to watch the grainy footage from the runway camera, showing the A-10's approach and landing. Someone isolated a frame showing Cowery in the cockpit, visible through the damaged canopy, her hands on the controls. The image became iconic almost immediately. At Incirlik, a squadron commander used the incident as a teaching moment, breaking down the decisions Cowery must have made. Emergency procedures, risk assessment, resource management. It was a masterclass in airmanship, delivered without her knowledge or consent. Back at Bagram, Cowery woke to find a different world than the one she'd left. The news had gone beyond the military. Somehow, Volkov suspected a journalist embedded with the Marines. The story had leaked to civilian media. Not the full details, security concerns prevented that, but enough to make headlines. Female pilot lands crippled after being declared dead. Against all odds, captain's impossible flight home. The pilot they couldn't kill. Cowery read the headlines on Volkov's tablet and felt her stomach sink. This was exactly what she'd feared. They'd made her a story, a narrative, a symbol. The details hardly mattered, the arc was what counted. Underdog overcomes adversity. Woman succeeds in man's world. Triumph against impossible odds. It was reductive and simplistic and missed the point entirely. She wasn't a symbol. She was a pilot who'd done her job under difficult circumstances. That should be enough. But it wasn't, and she knew it wouldn't be. Major Reyes cleared her for discharge that morning with instructions to take it easy and follow up if symptoms worsened. Cowrie dressed in a clean flight suit someone had brought, then stepped outside into the bright Afghan sun. A small group had gathered, word having spread that she was being released. Pilots, ground crew, even some Marines who'd heard the radio chatter. They applauded when she emerged. Not loud or boisterous, but genuine. A recognition between professionals. Cowrie acknowledged them with a nod, uncomfortable with the attention, but understanding its necessity. They needed this, needed to celebrate a win in a war that offered few clear victories. If it made them feel better, she could endure a little applause. She walked toward the operations center, where she'd been summoned for the inevitable debrief. The morning was already hot, temperature climbing toward the oppressive highs that made afternoon missions miserable. But she barely noticed. Her mind was organizing her thoughts, preparing for the questions that would come. The operations center was busy, personnel moving with purpose between workstations. Conversations paused as she entered, eyes tracking her movement. She kept her expression neutral, professional, gave nothing away. A major she didn't know well approached, introduced himself as the investigating officer. He led her to a conference room where the formal debrief would take place. The room was standard military issue. Conference table, metal chairs, wit.